Okay. Let's try this again.
Welcome to Forking Off, the podcast by former feds who got the fork out. I'm Jill Fields.
And I'm Philip Fields.
Now, before we get started, make sure to hit the follow button.
You can find all our content and show notes on our website, forkingoff.com.
And if you enjoy what we do and want to help, consider supporting us on Ko-fi. Hi, we have a fantastic episode today. We'll be talking with Jeff Sizemore, who worked in atrocity prevention at State Department before he resigned last year.
We met Jeff through our previous guest, Madeline Velturo. Jeff works with Madeline on the YouTube show Former Feds and Friends.
I love that show. They use TV, movies, pop culture to explore some really weighty topics like democracy, peace, and stability.
It's an engaging and relatable way to make sense of the challenges that we face.
Yeah, learning about forced migration, information wars, and displacement is much more palatable when talking about Supergirl, House of Dragons, and Zootopia 2.
Speaking of Zootopia 2, you said in the most recent episode of Former Feds and Friends, Jeff mentioned he was a consultant on identity-based violence for that movie. He's even listed in the credits.
Yes, isn't that impressive? That is so cool. So Jeff is going to be talking with us about his departure from government service and the impact of the government downsizing, for lack of a better term, and how these impacts are felt not just in the U.S., but globally.
He'll share what he's currently up to and how he's continuing to work in what he feels is our obligation to protect marginalized communities.
All right, let's check it out. Hi, so today we have with us Jeff Sizemore. Hi, Jeff. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Jeff, why don't we go ahead and just jump right in and give us your bluff, your bottom line up front.
So I am Jeff Sizemore. Until September of 2025, I was the senior advisor on atrocity prevention and the deputy director in the Office of Security and Human Rights in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department. I had the responsibility of knitting together a lot of the different atrocity and genocide prevention efforts for the Human Rights Bureau and kind of working with those partners across the interagency and across kind of the globe multilaterally to advance the idea of the risk of genocide, the risk of crimes against humanity, the risk of war crimes. Let's try to reduce that as much as possible, and that human rights are good and war crimes are bad.
That's extremely important. Before we jump into all of that work that you were doing, why don't you give us a little bit of your background and how you got into public service?
Absolutely. So I am the son of a family that had a history of service. My dad was in the Air Force. His father was in the Air Force. On my mom's side, both my uncles and my grandfather all had Navy service. And so though it was never pushed, it was sort of a awareness and a introduction to, and it was in the ether. And so when push came to shove and I was kind of reaching that point of finishing high school and thinking about what's next, I initially went to college and had an academic scholarship, and it didn't go super well, wasn't quite ready. And as I was kind of thinking about what I needed to do, I went down to the recruiter, and they were quite excited to have me. And so I joined the Navy as a young sailor and was kind of just going to go and do that, specifically with the idea of having the GI Bill and the Navy College Fund, knowing that eventually kind of going back to school was in my path. But fortunately, the program I was in, I was a nuclear electrician for submarines. Because there was a fair number of college dropouts, they had a program where you could kind of go back to college early. And so I got picked up for what was called Seaman Admiral. And after 2 years of service of the 6 that I owed, I went back to school and I went to George Washington University for the ROTC program with the very helpful axe hanging over my head that if I didn't do well academically, I was going to go back and serve out the remainder of my enlistment, which is a really fantastic motivator.
I was going to say, that's some motivation.
And so knowing that that was out there, College the Sequel was a far more successful event. I think I was better in headspace. It's amazing what being 20 by being 18 is. And, you know, having been in the military and working brutal hours, all of a sudden college seemed a heck of a lot more manageable. I graduated from GW and I was commissioned in the Navy in 2001, which meant that 3 months into my naval career, 9/11 happened, which then obviously colored almost my entire naval career. My first deployment was to the Gulf, doing sanctions enforcement in the Gulf, which was 6 months after 9/11. And so that really shaped kind of the whole thing. And so I was a surface warfare officer for 20 years. deploying throughout the Middle East, the Pacific, et cetera. I was based mostly on the West Coast, served on destroyers, cruisers, and eventually the last step was as the auxiliaries officer on an aircraft carrier, the Nimitz. And as I was kind of coming towards the end of that career, there was a requirement that officers get what is called joint, meaning you have to go see something else in the world and you can't just be stuck in your little pot. And there were a bunch of options available. I could have gone to the Pentagon, worked for a combatant commander, but there was this fun little job working at the State Department. And I had gone to GW, and George Washington State actually share the same real estate. They are both located there in Foggy Bottom. And that seemed appealing. And the job happened to be in the Human Rights Bureau. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So maybe go and look at that. And I had very little idea. It was pretty opaque, but that was the mechanism that kind of got me to state. Once I was there, was kind of given a bunch of the different portfolios and things like that, atrocity prevention being one of them. And it went well enough that at the time when my tour as an exchange officer ended, I retired from the Navy and became a civil servant because I thought that the work was interesting and worth doing and kind of continuing. And it was my intention that Act 2 professionally was going to be military officer and then civil servant. And that was what got me to DRL and allowed me to stick around.
That's awesome. That's a good long way of getting to the State Department, but you got there and you did some really cool things. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you were doing at State Department and how all of that work was going before we go into the 2025
Indeed.
situations.
So I got to the State Department about 4 months into the first Trump administration. When I accepted the orders, it was before the election had happened. And so I don't think anybody really knew what was coming. And, I was going to the State Department regardless. And actually, to that point, I'd been a military officer for 20 years. I believed very much in an apolitical sort of government service. I believed very much that I had served under Republican and Democratic presidents. And the idea was you did what needed doing. And I knew exactly what the oath to the Constitution was. And I was actually pretty comfortable with that. I got to a State Department that was in a lot of flux. And I think that kind of happens regardless of who is in power. Every time there's a change in administration, you kind of get that flow in and flow out. But because of the folks and the kind of change, they were short bodies. And so I had the ability to get a couple portfolios that I might not have otherwise, simply because they needed government people to be able to do it. And contractors aren't ostensibly not allowed to do policy work, but I, as a military officer, was a government employee, so I could do that. And so initially I was kind of given a slate of things. I was doing reviews of weapons for human rights concerns. I was looking at AI, and this is AI in 2017, long before any of the ChatGPT and things like, so it was a much more ephemeral and much more sort of theoretical look at human rights and AI. I'm so thrilled that that's not my job now. But lethal autonomous weapons, I was looking at women, peace, and security. I was looking at anti-corruption and then atrocity prevention. And I was an expert in none of them, but being a military officer and kind of used to that, get tossed in pool, learn how to swim fast and figure it out. That wasn't so terrifying because that had kind of been the nature of every one of the job changes over the course of my career. So did a bunch of reading, a bunch of trying to go to meetings, a bunch of listening. And what happened was in 2019, the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act was passed. And so there's a law that says, hey, not only is atrocity prevention a bad thing morally, but it's actually in the United States national interest. That's actually the first line of the legislation. And it says, we're going to do something about this and we're going to put resources to, and we're going to think about it. And it had a legal requirement. Number one being the administration had to report each year to Congress what actually happened. So that there had to be something to say on this is what we did to prevent atrocities. And then also that there had to be training. And that any foreign service officer that was either going to an embassy that was either at risk or experiencing atrocities had to be trained on how to do prevention. During the course of my Navy career, I'd worked at department head school. I'd been the lead on education on the aircraft carrier. And so I had done some classes on how to do adult ed, and I'd been an instructor. And so as we're trying to figure out how to do this training for the first time, I had a bit of background in that. And they had not been super successful in figuring out how to expend the resources. And so made some calls, talked to civil society, talked to some people I knew at the Auschwitz Institute. And we kind of built out this first curriculum and took it on the road, took it to Johannesburg and brought people from 25 different embassies across the continent down and managed to kind of talk through, okay, so what would you be looking for? What are you going to do about it? What are the options? How do you recover after atrocities happen? What does justice look like? fair number of logistics to kind of make that happen, trying to get all those people moving. But that was actually something that kind of used to doing, right? You're managing maintenance on an aircraft carrier. There's a lot of figuring out how to get from point A to point B and kind of all the different steps. And so I think I had a skill set that maybe not everybody that I was working with did. And so that was kind of my specific value proposition. And it wasn't me. I brought a cadre of 12 different instructors that we had folks from global criminal justice and conflict and stabilization and programming folks and experts, because certainly I was never the smartest person in that room, and making sure that we had a bunch of folks kind of together to be able to talk through that. And that went really well. And I think that was ultimately kind of what made my ability to become a civil servant possible, because there was a need to kind of keep doing this. That was part of thinking through kind of the whole infrastructure. And one of the things that the Elie Wiesel Act mandates is that there has to be kind of an interagency process, because if it's only state doing it, it's only the Human Rights Bureau doing it, the likelihood that you're going to be able to move these big, difficult, huge foundational problems, pretty low. And so it took kind of a whole of government effort, starting with the Atrocity Prevention Board in 2012. There had been kind of a succession of entities focused on this specifically. So it was the Atrocity Prevention Board. Then under the first Trump administration, it was the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force. Then under the Biden administration, it was the Atrocity Prevention Task Force. But it was the same entity, so that you had folks from state, and you had folks from Department of Defense, and you had folks from Treasury, and you had folks from USAID, and you had folks from Commerce. All of these, DHS, FBI, Justice, all coming together to say, hey, if the US government was going to try to look abroad and help a partner government with reducing the risk of large-scale violence against civilians, what might that look like? And how would you do that? And it was just kind of a means to bring all the best capabilities from the different parts together in a way that made sense. And so I was, thrilled to do that. And then also externally, right? Because even if it's just the US operating unilaterally, still not going to be effective, because these problems are huge. And so who are the like-minded partners in the UK, in the EU, Australia, et cetera? How do we work with them to kind of come up with ideas on how to do this better? I was able to both do work kind of domestically, thinking through kind of that whole of government approach, but then also thinking multilaterally, how do we interact with the UN? How do we interact with the International Criminal Court, et cetera, on kind of how to do this? And that I got to be part of that team that was advancing this inside the United States government, which one of the things I liked really a lot during all of that phase was I was never on the wrong side of the moral question. No matter kind of what the argument was, genocide bad, that's always kind of a good place to be. And that, sometimes you had to make decisions that were difficult as far as who you would partner with and things like that. But I was pretty convinced that what we were doing was reducing the risk of crimes against humanity, probably on the right side historically.
Absolutely on the right side. So you're at state, you're doing atrocity prevention, you're absolutely on the right side of history there with helping countries, helping people stay safe. Walk us through 2025 with what happened there.
In the lead up to the change in administration, I think there was a lot of questions as far as how things were going to go, and a lot of questions as far as what was going to be the priority. We in the Human Rights Bureau had been through the first Trump administration, and though there had been a change in focus on like which countries we were paying attention to, or exactly how strident or stringent or loud we were going to be, the work that democracy still mattered, that human rights were important, that had kind of consistently continued. And if anything, the legislation that sort of made my job possible, this act, was actually signed by President Trump. And so I was maybe naively, maybe optimistically, I'm not sure which, of the opinion that yes, it was going to be different than sort of the Biden administration, but we were still going to have space to work. And in some ways, I found that even during the first administration, sometimes a little bit of we weren't the priority. And because we weren't the priority, we had some freedom of action and some freedom of movement that actually benefited us. And that, especially in some of those kind of quieter spots where it wasn't a huge US concern, we could make some real substantive change because there wasn't anything to push back against. And so that was sort of what the hope was. And then the reality was wildly, wildly different. And so pretty much almost immediately, there was the process of trying to justify what everyone was doing. I had moved into a leadership position as the deputy director. And so we were writing up justifications for like each person, like what they did. Some of those justifications had to be tweet length, which certainly felt really kind of awful and dismissive of people's service. And, not just friends inside of the Democracy Human Rights Bureau, but friends across kind of the whole of the State Department were all getting kind of pressure and questions. And we were seeing who was and was not being confirmed into positions. And it all just looked pretty dire. And annually, there's a debate at the UN on the responsibility to protect, which is kind of this global norm from 2005 that says all countries should take care of their own people and not allow them to come to atrocities. The second pillar is if somebody is having trouble with that and they ask for help, other states that have the ability should help. So like do what you can. And then the last pillar is if there is kind of a complete failure of government and a failed state, and there is no ability, if the Security Council determines, then you might be able to intervene externally, even without the consent of the state, because it's a failed state. I think pretty reasonable and not too terribly controversial that helping other folks protect their people when available is a good thing. The US said that the responsibility to protect was a dangerous concept in 2025. We said that, it runs against sovereignty. And though we were a signatory to the World Summit Outcome Document in 2005, all of a sudden now we're positioning ourselves that R2P is a bad idea. Well, what I do is directly tied to that. And so I sort of, reading the writing on the wall, had the good sense that I'm not sure that we're going to kind of keep doing this. And then the kind of assistance freeze, my closest partners inside of the Human Rights Bureau were the folks that specifically did human rights and democracy and atrocity prevention programming. So maybe it's helping fund high frequency radios in villages at risk so that they can radio to each other when an armed group is coming in and that they can do protection, or using the radios to get kids that have been pulled out of armed groups to get them home. Maybe it's doing protection for women's groups that are providing psychosocial support for victims of trauma and victims of atrocity so that they can kind of rebuild their lives. There's a bunch of different things that you can do to reduce atrocity risk. If you improve infant mortality, if you improve women's political participation, if you improve journalism and the ability to hold people to account, if there is accountability for past crimes and past things, all of these things kind of consequentially reduce the overall risk. And all assistance stopped. That was kind of one of those things. And all of the programming that we had kind of been doing globally, which in the grand scheme of things was a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. I mean, a truly small amount of money. It ends up kind of being almost budget dust compared to some of the things in other spending. But for those communities, especially when it was really good and grassroots and focused, it made a difference. All of that stopped. And so one of the kind of major aims and one of the major things that we had done to kind of reduce atrocity risk suddenly went away. And so in light of all this, I was kind of worried. And so I was thinking about, okay, so what else? Because I didn't become a civil servant. I didn't sort of join the State Department because I so desperately wanted to work at the State Department. It was, I had been really fortunate and kind of stumbled into this work, and this felt like worth doing. And so I started kind of looking around at what might be possible elsewhere. And then the RIFs really started. And so all of my colleagues in conflict and stabilization, their entire bureau was eliminated. So they were the secretariat for the Atrocity Prevention Task Force, they go away. Then all my colleagues in global criminal justice, they're eliminated. So the entire, like one of the pillars of that, if you don't get justice and you don't stop the cycle of violence, it's just going to keep going. That's suddenly gone away. And then inside of the Democracy Human Rights Bureau, my Office of Security Human Rights was eliminated. The Office of Global Programs was eliminated. The Office of Near East Asia Affairs was eliminated. Would that be helpful right now as we're looking at conflict in the Middle East? Boy, that might be some expertise that would be valuable. The Office of South Central Asian Affairs was eliminated. Just kind of a bunch of places where there was clear risk and clear issues were just gone. And so I was not actually RIFed. My office was sort of split in two and we were farmed out to other places. And I was given the opportunity to be the senior advisor on sanctions so that we could use human rights sanctions tools to go after judges in places where we didn't like their answers, and against the International Criminal Court, and against genocide in South Africa, which we had not seen a ton of evidence of. And so it just did not seem to me that that was a position that I could, in any kind of good moral standing or in any sort of understanding of what I'd been working on, take. And so because I had the ability to, I tendered my resignation in 2025 and figured I could go kind of do other stuff elsewhere and go do that work. And, I'm fully aware that some of my situation was different than a lot of my peers in that I have a pension because of my military service and that my medical care is not tied directly to my job. And so my family and I were able to sort of make the decision that this was the right thing and that we could go kind of look elsewhere. I don't pass judgment on anybody that didn't have that luxury and didn't have that ability, but I did. And as somebody who had kind of taught leadership in the military, there was always your oath is to the Constitution. You will not follow an order that is immoral. You will not follow an order that is illegal. And then I taught atrocity prevention inside the State Department. And if you look at kind of a lot of what happens in big atrocity conditions, it's the bureaucrats that didn't stand up and help facilitate. When you're doing killing at an industrial scale, it takes a lot of, not just the person holding the machete or holding the rifle. There's a lot of steps that happen. And the cognitive dissonance in not sort of acting in that moment was more than I could kind of stomach. And so I made the decision to walk away and tendered my resignation and sort of figured out, okay, I thought there were going to be 2 acts, military and then civil service. Well, let's see what Act 3 looks like.
Yeah. Philip, I know you have thoughts of the International Criminal Court. And
I have so many thoughts. I'm almost hesitant to ask. I mean, like when the strike started in the Caribbean, when the invasion happened in Venezuela, when they announced the bombings in Iran, and then when they invaded Iran more recently, all of this is just shocking to the conscience. And obviously, the United States is 100% to blame for this, but also on the international scale, in Venezuela, there was a lot of talk about exporting oil and things of that nature, which Venezuela is a signatory to the International Criminal Courts. And for actions that are taken in contrast to that, somebody could actually be held accountable in any one of the countries where they travel if they're exporting oil as part of an illegal war in Venezuela. And so I was really looking forward to the part where some executives who signed on to that started getting held accountable, but I haven't seen it yet. I think that's one of the things that's really stood out to me that I'm hoping is still coming down the line at some point. If we can't hold ourselves accountable right now, that maybe the international community does it. And so going after judges seems like a way to try and keep them from doing that.
I think a lot of what we saw as far as who they were eliminating kind of across the government were the people that would stand up and say, hey, this isn't okay. And that those sorts of voices were not interested, were not valued, were not listened to. And so, you start out kind of eliminating the internal voices that might push back. And then you figure out where you can pressure externally on kind of those voices. And, international accountability has never been known as especially speedy. I think that's kind of one of the big complaints is that these justice processes take a long time. The fact that there is still ongoing justice processes for Bosnia, which is decades ago, and Rwanda, which is decades ago, that these things don't just magically happen fast. And I think for the folks that believe in international justice and international accountability, the idea is that if we get there eventually, then it's still justice. And that if you go really fast and you kind of make snap judgments, well, then that also calls into question, is it due process? Is it fair? And things like that. And so some of the kind of slowing down, though occasionally unsatisfying, does actually also show that it's real and that it stands up to scrutiny, and that when these decisions are made, it's not just sort of victor's justice, and it's not just hammering because it's convenient. It's like, no, we as an international community have said that this is not okay. And I do think that accountability for the actions is necessary, because we can have shown pretty clearly in the literature and kind of in research that impunity breeds more stuff. If you look at the Sudan context currently, it looks really similar to stuff that happened in Darfur 20 years previously. And it's because there wasn't necessarily sufficient accountability, so that some of those same players and some of the same tools and the same dance card is happening a second time. And so I don't know if, I think it might be too old at this point to be optimistic, but I do sort of hope that eventually there is accountability, that because justice has to apply kind of globally, right? It can't be just for the strong to punish the weak when they want to. It has to kind of go. But the problem is, it's not like The Hague has cops. It's not like the International Criminal Court has folks that can go out and just sort of get folks. That's not how it works. It's that the international community kind of collectively comes together. And so I think absolutely accountability is something that's going to be necessary, both inside the US and outside, that we have to look at some of the decisions that were made and how that goes, and address clearly where there have been violations. I knew what the Uniform Code of Military Justice was, and I was certainly part of accountability things that happened over the course of my career where sailors or other folks ran afoul of kind of what the rules were. And there was a means to address that. And I believed in that and knew I was also subject to it. I think that's the way it's supposed to work, that there has to be a right and wrong. And that when you cross those lines, there has to be some penalty for that. And so I certainly think the actions of the United States have to be looked at really with incredible scrutiny, because at least from an external perspective now, since I'm no longer inside, a lot of it, as far as I'm looking at public source reporting, seems to run counter to what I understood the rules were.
Yes, absolutely. Well, speaking of being on the outside and speaking of outside of the US, why don't you share with us what you have been doing since you left and where you are now?
Yep. So I am talking to you all from bright, sunny, beautiful Brisbane, Australia. I am the Mary Ming-Wing Lee Senior Human Rights Research Fellow at the Asia Pacific Center on the Responsibility to Protect, located at the University of Queensland. I resigned in September and started reaching out to kind of civil society and academic places that I knew to be like, hey, do you want some help? Do you have a spot to kind of give a suffering government refugee a soft place to land? And because I'd had the job specifically of doing training, I'd gotten to meet a lot of partners in the education space, because it's not like I had all the answers. And so we had to reach out to experts to build out curriculum. It certainly wasn't going to be just Jeff Thought's trademark. Like that wasn't going to be sufficient. Like there had to be kind of that level of expertise. And so you build a network, not because you thought you needed it, but it was interesting in that moment to be like, all right, let's start seeing who's got spots. And so shortly after I resigned, I got to go down to Johannesburg to the International Association of Genocide Scholars. And they were really interested in what was happening in the US. And I got to give a speech down there and talk to a bunch of the scholars, which was really helpful. And some colleagues in Australia had reached out to the Asia Pacific Center and said, hey, there's this guy who's out there and he's got some time and some expertise. Would it be interesting? And so the head of APR2P and I got a chance to sit down, and we had a pretty similar background. And I think the initial, does this work from a vibes perspective? They have a pretty stringent no jerks policy. And so I had to make sure I met that bar, because, you want to like the people that you're working with. And I am incredibly grateful, but they offered me the ability to come do this fellowship in Brisbane. And so in early 2026, got an airplane and flew across the globe down here to Brisbane, with the idea being, let's think about kind of the Pacific. Let's think about atrocity prevention, especially in a Pacific and Southeast Asian context. That's where their work has. And because the center is co-located with the University of Queensland, there's also a really strong academic component. And we sit inside the political science school. And so talking to folks that are looking at Myanmar and looking at conflict in Southeast Asia between Vietnam and Thailand, and thinking about where historically has there been atrocities, and there have been. We've certainly seen that. The U.S. declared atrocities that occurred in the Myanmar context against Rohingya refugees. Obviously, we've seen issues in Cambodia and other places. And so the idea is, how can we train? How can we teach? Because that's, being at a university, that's certainly the focus. Is it's not so much advocacy, but like if you train people on where to see risk and you give them the idea of, hey, this is out there, and if you start to smell smoke, it means fire is probably coming, and it's far easier to put it out when it's smoldering than when it's a full-blown house fire. And that was kind of the idea. And so I've gotten a chance to meet with a bunch of classes. I've done some speaking engagements with the folks here. We ran a simulation for a bunch of the students so that they could try to put theory to practice, give them a fictionalized sort of tabletop exercise so they can kind of step through, and just continue to kind of work on that and do some research and do some writing, done some editing, helped with some of their country reports, kind of continuing from a slightly different vantage point, but I think still working towards the idea that better is possible, and that there's a bunch of folks that want to do that. And this is a place where I felt like I could continue to join a team that was pointed and was working under something that I understood. And it's gone well. I'm coming to the close. I'm going to next week head out to Perth and do some work at the University of Western Australia. They saw that I was on the continent and wanted to take advantage, because it's a lot cheaper when I'm here than trying to fly me in from the United States. But I think the hope is that maybe this initial period of the fellowship was the appetizer, and that maybe we can do a bit of a longer stint, because I think there's more work to do. And I've certainly felt a culture fit and a vibe fit. And it's just awesome to be around people that care deeply. And, that's one of the things I found most gratifying when I was in the Human Rights Bureau was everybody I worked with cared so much and they really wanted to do better. And one of the things that I found most infuriating about this whole RIF process was these are really, really smart, good people that could have gone into industry or could have gone into really high-powered law, and that they actually chose to do this because they thought it mattered and they cared, and they took less money and they took more stringent controls, but it's because they believed in the mission. And to be so dismissive and so nonchalant in getting rid of all that is, I think, just incredibly insulting, but also strategically such a waste of resources and such a dumb move as far as the strength of the country. And so I certainly didn't want to go to a place where people didn't care. And one of the things that I've really felt comfortable here at UQ and at the Asia Pacific Center is that similar vibe of people who really deeply in their bones believe we have an obligation to protect marginalized populations, that we have an obligation to take care of the folks that can't take for themselves, and that is possible if there's energy and effort put towards it. And how do we marshal that in the most efficient and effective way possible? And so the plan is kind of keep pushing here. I'm going to be teaching a class in the fall once I come back to the United States, again, on how you do prevention in practice, talking to students and, kind of doing that professor of practice role. Because I think, the education space is certainly something where I think that's going to be kind of where the third act goes.
Very nice. I really like so many of the things that you've mentioned and said here, especially better is possible. Better is possible. And I know Philip and I both, we've talked with so many people about we worked with people who really cared, who had amazing credentials that could have gone anywhere. They chose government work because they cared about the people and they cared about the mission. And everyone we've talked to from State Department, it's been the same thing of this mission matters and we care about this. It really shows. It was a caring department.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Very
and
much.
What a discount. What an unbelievably good investment for the US taxpayer. That was just such a good use of money, was those human beings, that intellectual capital, that expertise in an era when we complain about, the cost of the $7,000 gold toilet and things like that. Those individuals were absolutely the best bargain going.
Oh, absolutely.
You've touched on it a lot, what people can do. There's probably still a lot of people who were riffed from the State Department who haven't found work and are probably struggling with that in all sorts of ways. With Jill and I, we've started our own thing, but for people out there who are sort of in that in between, are there things that you recommend or that they can do that don't require them to be enrolled in an academic program or have access to large funds? Where do you start?
Obviously, this question comes up a ton because it's not like we're all not still connected, and it's not like those text chains aren't just kind of blowing up, because so many of these people were sort of just dumped into, and it's not just state, right? USAID had an absolute huge number of people that did all of this work. United States Institute of Peace eliminated, United States Agency for Global Media. So many people that were sort of thinking, if not directly, at least tangentially on these kinds of issues, all just sort of dumped into the space. And so I've seen some folks kind of go that entrepreneurial route that the two of you have sort of undertaken, and I'm super excited and I hope that works out. I think that's a super challenging space. Obviously, the monetization and the how does that become kind of real? And that's harder because with kind of the assistance freeze, a lot of the money available to kind of keep these programs is hard. I think one of the most frustrating things was not only was all these people's jobs eliminated, but many of the NGOs and civil society organizations that they might have gone to all of a sudden had to cut staff too, because all of a sudden the financial backing was gone at the same time. And I believe very much in philanthropy, and I think that's a crucial part, but the gap that has just sort of existed globally from the US pullout is just so huge. I do think there's been a bit of a brain drain, and I think there's been a fair amount of folks kind of globally that have recognized that and are taking advantage. And so looking abroad, because the EU is still doing work on this space. The UK is still doing work. Australia is still doing work. Canada is still doing work. And so I certainly wouldn't be looking around DC right now, because I think that's just such an unbelievably difficult supply and demand kind of condition. People are getting gigs, like it's happening. Oftentimes it's at lower rates than they were making before, or it's contractor jobs. jobs and not the sort of stability of the civil service position. I believe that the pendulum will swing, because I think pendulums always kind of swing, and that there will be a recognition that some of what was cut was absolutely crucial, and that we've already seen some rehiring and some of that. But as long as the direction is still what it is, I'm not sure that would be an answer I would be comfortable with. I also think local government. I think there's a fair number of states that have certainly benefited from the unbelievable quality of individuals available, and that some of those states, have been doing a good job of kind of come home and work here. I certainly have encouraged folks to sort of look at that, because I've got a friend who's working on food insecurity in New York. Well, that's a really important thing, and it's making a concrete, tangible difference in that community. It's not the global portfolio that she had before, but it's still super meaningful work that's sort of driving that. And I think some of the states have certainly benefited from the ability to kind of pull from that. I think still there's always a need for new bodies and new voices, and that people kind of retire, and so that there will still be some NGO. And after the incredible crush of losing kind of funding, there will be some belt tightening and there'll be some efficiencies and stuff like that, but they'll figure out what the new version is, and so that some of those positions will open. And so it's a matter, as I talk to folks, you have to be pretty open and really kind of widen that aperture, because it's incredibly competitive, because there's just so many awesome candidates. There's so many good people doing it. And I know folks that have done kind of pro bono work, which is so important, and volunteer and things like that, but also food needs to be purchased, and cost of living is certainly not going down. And so finding something that is meaningful but also meets the bill requirements is super important. And so I've taken the tack of kind of looking abroad a bit. I think and know that there are opportunities available, and so I think folks, if their situation allows, if they're open to moving, if that is what their family can deal with, because that's not everybody, that's certainly a place I would encourage folks to look.
I was going to mention, since you said like the state and local governments, there's a group called Civic Match, Work for America. They push out jobs to interested candidates. And it is especially important for these individuals that have specialized skills that were honed in the federal government. The state governments are absolutely seeing that and taking advantage of it. I know in California, several former colleagues are working for the state now, and they're thriving, and they're building programs that the state needed, especially with as large of an economy as California has. But they've been building programs, and they've been able to make an impact. So that is something that is available there. But yeah, they did take pay cuts to do that.
Yep.
All right. Last question. What would it take for you to go back?
So I think eventually there's going to be a recognition that the atrocity prevention enterprise kind of needs to be rebuilt. I don't think we came to the conclusion that this was worth doing as a government, as a nation, by mistake. The lessons coming out of the Holocaust, and then the lessons of Bosnia, and the lessons of Rwanda, and the lessons of Sudan, and the fact that when violence like this happens, it is not good for the United States. It's not good for business. It's not good for stability. It's not good for democracy. And that we have a vested interest in that model of stability and sort of the global order working is good for us. So I do believe that at some point there will be a need to kind of build back. For me to come back, I would want the ability to do that and to be part of that, but at a level where I'm able to kind of make some of the decisions and have the hand on the wheel. I don't think I would come back in kind of the role that I was in before. I would want something more senior and the ability to be more of a driving force and having more of a say and agency and kind of where things are going, instead of simply carrying out some direction and things like that. I like building stuff. I like figuring out, I like plan of actions, and I like milestones, and I like the logistics of kind of constructing something. There's going to be a lot of construction necessary. This was not simply just kind of elimination. This was tearing it down to the studs and removing the foundation. They've gotten rid of some of the buildings where some of the folks that I worked in even exist. And so there's not even real estate for them to go to. And so that construction project would be huge, which would obviously be a massive effort from so many people. The ability to do that at a level where I felt like I could build it back better and smarter and take some of the lessons learned that we kind of learned over the 20 years of what the atrocity prevention enterprise looked like. And when we did 2.0, make it smarter, that would be of interest to me. I am hopeful that that kind of comes around and that opportunity. But at present, I'm trying to build the next generation of folks that are eventually going to go do those jobs, because I do believe that there's going to be a point in the future when that's necessary. And so getting to the students early and talking to them and kind of giving them some of that perspective now, if anything, I feel like hopefully along with the rest of the folks working in the space and teaching in the space, we're planting the seeds for kind of the next generation of diplomats and the next generation of implementers and the next generation of folks that do believe better is possible and are actually going to do the work necessary to bring that to fruition.
We've started hearing a lot of similar sort of ideas about the rebuilding. People do want to go back. They do want to be a part of it, but they all have sort of that same concern of, I can't go back and do what I was doing because I need to be able to protect what I build if I do. And I think the theme there is a desire for more accountability, more independence, stronger protections for federal workers than what we had going into this, because we always thought that we had it, but clearly we didn't have it the way that we assumed that the system would work.
It can't just be every 4 years you're sort of waiting to see if you're going to be canned, because that's just not sustainable. You have no institutional memory. You have no learned skills. There's no knowledge management. That's not, in my mind, a means of viably having any kind of consistency across policy. And that's bad for us internally. And it's also bad for our partners globally. How do they have any faith that any agreement they make with the United States is going to stand longer than till the next election? That's not how you build trust. That's not how you build partnership. And so I think a real work to ensure that, the civil service is supposed to be that kind of continuity. That's a feature, not a bug. That's a good thing. I certainly would hope and demand that there be more of that, because otherwise you're just sort of waiting, like, cool, we fixed it for 15 minutes and all of a sudden there's going to be another kind of crack in the foundation the next time around.
It's not great for the U.S. economy either.
Nope.
No, not at all. Not at all. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we sign off?
No, just a real thank you for the opportunity to do this. And thanks for reaching out to so many different interesting people. And, to my friends and colleagues that continue to work in this space, I'm so thankful for them and for the work that they did, because obviously none of us are individuals, right? It's always part of the team and part of the process, and that none of this moves with just one person. I want nothing but the best for those folks to continue to be able to find the place for them to do the work. And thanks again for the opportunity to kind of lift up those voices and make it clear on kind of what was lost, and then also where there's opportunities for folks going forward.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks for forking off with us.
Thank you.
Wow, that was so insightful and just amazing what all he's been doing lately.
Yeah, it's great to see how Jeff is continuing to make an impact and educating others about atrocity prevention and human rights.
So what did we learn from all this? What can we do to help marginalized communities?
The best thing we can do is look for ways to get involved in our communities. We can volunteer, we can get involved with local politics, and as always, we can vote.
Yes, vote. Voting is super important. It feels lately like everything is so overwhelming, but starting in your local community will have an impact that can grow.
Agreed. All right, until next time, thanks for forking off with us. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Forking Off.
If you're a former Fed with a story to tell, or you're wrestling with your own ethical crossroads, reach out to us at info@forkingoff.com.
Today's episode was created, produced, and edited by Jill and Philip Fields. You can find more information about this episode at forkingoff.com. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, Mastodon, LinkedIn, or wherever you get your podcasts.